Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
Gene Bartz of Wisconsin Dells is an independent candidate in Assembly District 41. The election is November 3. Gene, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Steve. I appreciate it.
My first question for independent candidates is, why are they not running with traditional R or D?
That's a really good question. And I had thought about that when I first considered jumping into the race. The first question I asked was, well, what party would I run with? And I came to the conclusion that I could not align myself with a specific party because I don't agree with really the direction either party is going right now. I feel like we're getting way too far apart from each other, and we need to start bringing it back towards the center. We need to start looking more again at compromise and finding middle grounds to those paths forward, rather than this extreme partisanship that we're seeing. And my thought is, what better person to bring people back together than somebody that's not associated with the stigmas of either party?
Well, one of your issues on your social media is our, quote, roads are in, quote, terrible condition.
Yes.
Does that mean you'd vote for a gas tax like the governor recommended last year?
No, I really actually do not support a gas tax. I think that just puts too much burden on the Wisconsin taxpaying citizens at this point. Interestingly enough, though, on the flip side, I really don't like the increase of fees that we saw either. I understand, it was this $10 registration fee for regular automobiles. Wasn't a huge fan of that, but for me, I was fortunate enough that I could make that work. But then we saw this additional $75 fee for hybrid vehicles, and that kind of felt like a slap in the face, like we're punishing people for trying to be environmentally aware. So I feel like we've gotten into these pigeonholes of how we're raising funds, and we need to break out of that box and get more creative with how we're generating the revenue. One thing that I think that we should do is we should stop diverting our road money to projects that aren't roads. I mean, that right there would save a lot of money. If we could make sure that we if we have pigeonholed money for roads, have that money go for roads and not for other projects, tourist projects, et cetera. So I'd really like to see us kind of rein that spending back in, and also make sure that we are having competitive bids. We are, we've seen some improvement in that over the last 12 months or so, but we can find ways to control our costs and invest in our infrastructure without necessarily having to increase the burden on Wisconsin taxpayers.
Well, we're in the 6th month of dealing with a tragic pandemic. Let's talk about that for a bit. If state tax collections in the current fiscal year are short because of the pandemic, if they're short by, I'm making up a number, $1 billion, if you're in the legislature, would you cut spending or raise taxes and fees to deal with that shortfall?
Yeah, well, I think the good news is we're probably not going to be as short as we originally thought we were going to. So they just released a report here at the end of August that says our tax revenues were actually only down by less than 1%, which is really good considering everything that we've been going through. But I look at this in terms of my business experience. And when I'm looking to be able to increase the profitability of my business, I don't just look at cutting spending and I don't just look at increasing revenue. I look for ways to do both. And I think that's what the approach that we need to take and like I said, again, getting creative on how do we find new revenue streams that we can use to make up this shortfall, and how can we make sure that our spending is appropriate given the situation that we find ourselves in right now. Now, the other good news is we have about $760 million in the rainy day fund for our state, which will hopefully help cushion any shortfalls that we see. But I would really want to make sure that we are working across the aisle to find creative solutions on both sides, and cutting taxes and increasing revenue at the same time.
Face masks have become an emotional issue in the pandemic. Some state Senate Republicans say we'd like to come back to the Capitol and repeal the governor's statewide mask edict. What's your position on that edict?
This is one of the hot topics in my district for sure. And as I talk to people, I find that the district is about 50-50 split. It's that close with this particular issue. Now, personally, I don't feel like we can legislate people's bodies and legislate people into compliance with healthcare decisions. I feel like we really had a missed opportunity in this pandemic to be able to educate Wisconsin citizens on how to best protect themselves during this COVID pandemic. And some of this was understandable. Like right at the beginning, we were basically told, hey, stay home, social distance, but don't worry, you don't need to wear masks. And I get that we were trying to conserve the equipment for healthcare workers and for those that were on the front lines and were essential workers. But then we got into where half of the government was telling you, oh, you need to wear a mask. And now we're at the point where basically everybody is saying, yeah, you should wear a mask, but we see leadership on both sides of the aisles not leading by example. So where does that leave us? How do we know what to believe? And I feel like what needs to happen is more education, presenting the scientific reasoning, the facts and the data behind mask use. Now, it's not going to convince everybody, and I understand that, but we need to put the information in a place where our citizens can get it and understand it, and then make the best decisions for them. I know for me personally, I feel like I'd rather be safe than sorry. So if I'm going to go into Walmart or whatever, I'll put my mask on. If a business is asking me to put a mask on, I will certainly respect their right to do that, and I will wear the mask. And I mean, even my 9-year-old, over the last week, she said, I'll wear a mask, Mom, I'll do anything. I just want to go back to school. So, you know, she understands that this sacrifice that we make in comfort is really for a long-term benefit. And I think we just need to put the information out there in a nonpartisan, in a non-biased way, and then allow people to really make the best decisions for themselves.
As somebody with business experience, I want to ask you about a bill that Senator Chris Kapping introduced last week. It said if a business or an organization complies with COVID guidelines to protect patients, customers, or employees, they could not be sued over a COVID incident. Do you think we need that state law?
I absolutely believe that that is a protection that our small businesses should have for them. So we're at a point in this pandemic, we all understand the risk we take when we leave our house. If we're out in the community engaging in certain behaviors, we know the possible consequences of that. So we also have to take personal responsibility for our actions. But right now, our small businesses especially, they're already suffering so much between originally having to shut their doors, obviously sales and things are down, potentially having to lay people off, and some even having to shut their doors altogether. So we really need to make sure that those businesses, like you said, who are following guidelines, who are following the CDC guidelines, they're following the appropriate mandates, that they're not open to these frivolous lawsuits. On the flip side, if we have a business that is just blatantly ignoring the scientific evidence of how best to protect their employees and their customers, there's a liability there that I think everybody understands. But it's those businesses that are following the guidelines, but still just trying to keep their heads above water. They need that protection. So I do support that.
Hospitals in Wisconsin and certainly across the nation have been on the front lines of treating COVID-19 patients. So if you're elected to the legislature voting on the next state budget, should hospitals be given an even greater priority than they may have in the current budget?
That's a really interesting topic. I don't know if we can determine that they need a greater priority. There's going to be so many competing priorities for our state budget, especially given the ramifications that we're seeing from COVID. But there's certain things that we need to ensure. So we need to ensure that our healthcare system is prepared for situations like we found ourselves in this year. So making sure we have those stockpiles of PPE, of sanitizers, of essential medical equipment, so that our hospitals and our healthcare workers don't have to worry about that in the thick of the moment. and making sure that our rural hospitals and our rural clinics have that support, because it's already so difficult to find appropriate care in some of our rural areas. I know for myself, I have to drive at least 30 minutes to find a hospital. And if I'm trying to stay in network, then I'm relegated to like one hospital in my area. So those types of supports we can certainly build in, but we can't just have it be this carte blanche and say, hey, tell us what you need and we'll just give you everything, because that's not going to work either. I mean, I think we can pretty much all acknowledge that our healthcare system has some serious flaws, and in some ways is really broken. I've said for a long time, I think even a solidly middle-class family is one healthcare emergency away from absolute destitution. And I had some personal experience with this. About a year ago, I had to have an emergency surgery, which, by the way, I put off going in to the doctor because I knew that it was going to be an emergency room, and I was hoping that I could just tough it out. No pain, no gain. That's how I was raised. So I was trying to stick it out. Turns out I couldn't. I did actually need emergency surgery. It's now been 11 months, and I am still battling with my insurance company to get them to cover this claim. They've only processed about 20% of the claim for the services that I needed at that time. And I have spent, I don't know how many hours on the phone with the providers, with the insurance company, looking at my medical record, clearing up discrepancies for double bills or things that I never actually had happen. And it's just been an absolute nightmare. And to know that I'm maybe inordinately tenacious. So I look at this as a matter of principle, and I am going to get this covered because I paid for the coverage and they need to do their part. But so many people don't have that ability or that capability to be able to fight these battles on their own behalf. So I'd hate to see us do this, hey, tell us what you need, and then we just see costs rising and rising and rising and rising. It can't be like that. So if we're going to have priorities in our budget, they need to be specific, tangible, quantifiable priorities that we can then track to ensure that our money is being used in an appropriate way.
New subject. The debate over police reforms in the Capitol is playing out in three ways. The governor called a special session and he has a 9-bill package. The speaker is convening a task force. State Senator Van Wanggaard has his own ideas. He's a retired police officer. What, if any, police reforms do you think are needed?
This is, like you said, it's a hot topic, and it's a very interesting topic because I don't think any of the approaches that are being taken right now are incorrect. It's clearly something that we can and should address, but we need to make sure that we're not polarizing people on the topic. So anytime you hear this call for defunding the police, you're polarizing people. And even police reform, it makes people a little bit twitchy. They're not quite sure what that means. So digging into this topic, it's really interesting to see that when the Wisconsin Professional Police Association just released their basically their guidelines for what they would like to see in terms of police reform, it almost exactly matches up with what the governor's bills are. And that is so indicative, I think, of Wisconsin, because we have led the way in police accountability. I mean, in 2014, we were the first state to require that use of force incidents be investigated by an outside third party. So we've led the way so far, and I think we can continue to lead the way, but we have to do it in a way that encourages support of our police officers and incorporates them into the conversation, because politicians don't have all of the answers. I've said that from the get-go. We need to go to the people on the front lines in the industries that we're trying to pass legislation that it's going to affect, to get their feedback and say, here's what our thoughts are. How will this affect you on the front lines? Will it make it easier to do your job? Will it make it harder? Will it endanger your life? Is it going to protect the individuals? And it's really interesting to see some of these reforms that have come about. So like chokeholds is a really good example. Chokeholds are not taught in our law enforcement curricula. And the WPPA has even said, we don't oppose a ban on chokeholds. However, if an officer is in a situation where they are fighting for their life and they're able to get the subject in a chokehold and it saves the officer's life, that officer shouldn't get in trouble for that. That's common sense. So seeing that we already have essentially practices in place that support the reforms that we just want to put into the law books, I think there's ways to do this without polarizing the state over the topic and without our officers feeling like they don't have support from the communities, because I have so much respect for our local law enforcement. I've worked very closely with them at numerous, I would say, communities within my professional life. And I know I could not do what they do. And just to bring them into the conversation is so important. I don't want them to ever feel like the politicians are trying to do their job for them, or their actions are making it harder for police officers to come home safe at the end of the day. So I would really want to focus on engaging them in the conversation and making sure that the reforms are logical and able to be implemented safely in the field.
As more states around Wisconsin legalize medical and recreational marijuana, what's your position?
I really don't have an opinion on marijuana. I mean, I've never tried it myself. Maybe that has something to do with it. I'm not sure. But I do know the statistics support that something like 80% of Wisconsinites are in favor of legalizing medical marijuana. That's a no-brainer. The public wants it. We should make that happen. But even something like 63% of Wisconsinites are in favor of legalizing recreational marijuana. So that tells me it's something that we seriously need to investigate, because again, the majority of our people want it. So then it becomes a question of how can we implement it in a way that doesn't cause overt spikes in other issues, whether that be driving under the influence or other sorts of public safety hazards. At the same time, how can we then tie this in to best support our state? So I think Colorado raised something like, $200 million in tax revenue just off of marijuana. We could use that revenue. I would love to see something like that really dictated to go towards education or infrastructure or something that's going to benefit the public health. So while I don't really personally have opinion on it, I would certainly say that we should be responsive to the people in our districts in advocating for what it is that they would like to see.
Reapportionment, redistricting. Do you support the governor's call for a People's Maps Commission to draw the lines and then forward it to the legislature to be enacted?
In a way, yes. Backing this up a little bit, the majority of the counties in my district have already passed some sort of referendum that supports the fair map. So again, this is something that the people really want to see happen. So the legislature and the governor should absolutely be taking this up. Now, I think it's pretty much common sense that you don't put people in power in charge of determining who gets power. That doesn't make any sense. So to have these checks and balances, absolutely, I think that's appropriate. I don't know necessarily about a people's commission. I feel like the people drawing our maps should have experience in terms of deciphering the data, understanding the statistics of how the population counts will affect the votes, to really ensure that our maps are fair and equitable. And then they should come back to the legislature and they should come back to the governor for that final approval. I would like to see even maybe an outside third party to be able to draw up 3 different potential maps and then send those back so that the state then can pick out the one that we feel is the most fair and equitable for our state.
Property taxes in Wisconsin are high, which is why local governments and school boards have had to live with caps on property tax levies for more than 20 years. If you're in the legislature voting on the next state budget, would you vote to continue those caps and limits on property taxes?
Absolutely. This speaks to a topic that I'm very passionate about, given my professional life, affordable housing, and not just in the ability of people to afford rent, but also the ability of people to afford purchasing a home, because that home purchase is one of the most major purchases a family will make in their lifetime. And it is one of the major builders of wealth and equity in a household. So I saw this on a very personal level when my husband and I relocated to the Dells area just over 4 years ago. I'm sure you know the Dells spans about 4 counties. So we were determining where we were going to live, and property taxes had a lot to do with that. Adams County has a lower tax rate than many of the counties in our area. And just looking up kind of a similar house to the one that we bought, it would have cost us an additional $100 a month had we bought that same home in Sauk County. So to have the ability to pay a little bit less in our property taxes, it made it affordable for us to afford the small home that we did purchase. And that was such a huge thing for us to be able to own our own home. Now, I like the idea of referendums. I really like the idea of local control. So these referendums give local citizens the ability to determine what is and is not worth paying more for. And we just saw this in my area with the new high school that was built in the Dells. It went to referendum. Would you be willing to pay XYZ more on your property taxes to see this new high school? And when I looked at my property tax bills and went, man, if I pay an extra $200 a year, we have this beautiful new building that now actually supports our student population. Heck yes, that's worth it for me to pay that extra amount for. So each household had the ability to make that decision, and then the community came together to vote on it. So I think that's a very appropriate way, because we can't just rely on property taxes to fix funding issues that we see. It's not a sustainable solution.
Follow-up question. Do local governments need more revenue sources? Should, like Milwaukee County, be able to levy a half-cent sales tax? Do local governments need more alternatives to raise money to lessen their reliance on property tax?
Yes, like I said, I am all for local control. So I would like to see our local governments getting more tools in their belt in order to generate more revenue streams. Okay. I think it just makes sense, because the local governments, the local officials, not only will know how to educate their citizens on the cost benefit analysis of a certain increase or a certain tax, but they'll also know, and they'll get the feedback of when it's too much, and when people are like, no, I'm not willing to pay that little bit extra. It's not worth it for me for the services that you're telling me I'm going to get. So the more local control that we can give to our communities, I think the better off we're going to be in the long run.
If a school district, if a local government is planning a major public works project, should they have to give a preference to Wisconsin businesses? A study found in 2015, out-of-state contractors got contracts worth $72 million, but that more than doubled to $146 million by 2018. Should local governments have to give a preference to Wisconsin businesses?
In a way, yes. I'm not a fan of the phrase "have to," where it's mandated, you must do this certain thing. I would like to see, again, some creative problem solving and some compromise here on this. Because again, as a small business owner and working with businesses in my professional life, it makes sense to hire or to vend out your contracts locally. You get a better quality of service. Your company is wanting to see positive word of mouth so they can generate more business down the road, and they're more accessible. So if you have warranty work or follow-ups that need to be done, they're there for you, and they can come back and respond to you in an appropriate amount of time. However, there are times when your vendors are booked out far enough where it's not feasible for you to use them in your project. Or perhaps it's work that needs to be done where there is only one vendor in the state of Wisconsin. Well, that lack of competition is going to make it easier for prices to rise. So I'd like to see some sort of maybe a weighted point system. I see that a lot in the affordable communities that I work with in terms of development, where if you have certain features, you get extra credit essentially. Or perhaps we do like a checklist where you have to stay local unless XYZ criteria is met. Something that builds it in where it's not forcing school systems or local governments to pay exorbitantly more in the long run. But I think always there's a cost benefit analysis, because even if maybe you are paying, say, $100,000 more on a contract, what is that benefit from that? So what's the value of the jobs you're keeping in your community? What's the value of having a vendor that is nearby in order to fix any issues? What is the value of the revenue that that contract generates for your community? All of that has to be taken into play while we're making these contract decisions.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so quickly, differences between you and the R and the Ds that you're on the ballot with November 3.
Yes. Well, I would say one of the main differences is I have a lot of life experience. I may not have political experience, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. But, I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a full-time employee, I'm a small business owner, I'm a property owner. I understand in my guts how difficult things are right now for so many people in our district. And I know that I would be the best candidate for our district because I'm the one that can be and will be the most responsive to the people in the district. Because I don't have that R or D after my name, I don't have those partisan voices in the back of your head saying, well, you have to vote with us on this because you're a Democrat or because you're Republican. It's already assumed I vote for the people. I am obligated to the people, and I view the people as my boss. And that's what we need to bring back to our representation, because right now it's a matter of who's winning. Are the Republicans right or the Democrats right? Who's got the upper hand? Who's steamrolling over somebody else? That doesn't benefit the people. We need to break that cycle. We need to change the narrative and get people back to actually representing their districts and all of their districts, not just the 50% that affiliate with their particular party. My biggest fear is that we come out of November and half of my district feels like they don't get a voice for the next 2 years. And that's why I jumped into this race, so that I can ensure that that does not happen in my district.
Gene Bartz of Wisconsin Dells is an independent candidate in the 41st Assembly District. The election is November 3. Gene, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thank you. Again, I appreciate the time.
Thanks.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.